No, I
Hey,
don't.
hey, Lauren here. Let's talk about the minimum wage. Now, no matter what country you're in, usually the
Let's talk
conversation
about it,
around the
darling.
minimum wage involves progressives trying to raise it and conservatives. Well, no one really has enough balls to say that it should be removed or heck even just lowered, but at the very least, I would hope that conservatives oppose raising the minimum wage. And as essentially the queen of the progressive movement in America, it should come as no surprise that Miss AOC is strongly in favor of raising the minimum wage. In fact, she actually regards the current minimum wage as, I think, a capitalist dystopian nightmare, is the phrase she used.
Listen, I think that if any, not just Senator Manchin, but any person.
Well, just to be clear, the current minimum wage is so low that in almost any area in the United States, you cannot afford. You are forced to choose between eating or having a place to lay down your head at night that's behind a locked door, right? Um, and so to me, it seems like probably that's too low. Now, of course, is a minimum wage the best way to deal with that? Under current systems, I would say no, right? Because we would need to have other things in place to make it so that that wage was not just passed right back up the chain to the robber barons, right? So we would need things in place to make it so that you couldn't raise how much it costs to buy like a loaf of bread or gasoline or really anything the common people might want to buy. That would hand it a what I would refer to as a functional real value, right? And so if you were but there's all kinds of ways to ensure that sort of a real value of the goods. Um, but we don't have any of that in place. So changing the minimum wage, how much does that actually affect the common person? And the answer is probably less than we'd like to. And I would say generally, whenever you increase the minimum wage, handle it a little bit of settle time. You're gonna have to look pretty. It's gonna be weird, but people aren't gonna be making substantively that much more. All it's gonna really do, mid to long term, is make landlords rich because unless you freeze that, any anything that you do to raise wages artificially is just gonna be passed up the chain without lots and lots of things to make it so that you can't raise the prices on all of the things that common folk want to buy. The I think that the best way for us to deal with income inequality in this country is to repeal all of the laws that restrict union membership and to vigorously recruit for unions and to encourage people to join unions whenever we can. I think that's a foolproof method in terms of something that would increase the quality of life for your average worker in the country. I think there's almost no way that can go wrong. And there's very little way that the robber barons could use that against people. Now, of course, there are troubles with unions. Unions tend to be kind of run these days by the Democratic Party, which, of course, are bought and paid for by the robber barons. Same with the conservatives, of course. So that's a trouble. But that's just more of an interim issue because if we were to able to get significant interest in unions in this country, we could just get rid of the current union system and get one. Just get rid of the unions that we already have, trash them, get another union. You know what I mean? It'd be easy peasy to get done. So I feel like we could definitely do that. But in if someone was like, "Look, we need a higher wage," if that went through, I would be glad because anything that could possibly help people, I want. But I feel like at this point, with the way that the economy is, with the way that capitalism is, that money will not stay in the hands of workers. If we raise the minimum wage or if we hand people like the UBI, that'll go straight to landlords, and then it'll go to the banks, and then it'll go right back up to the robber barons. Um, So unionization is the only path that doesn't involve a significant amount of policy, which I think we have a very that's a hard road. You know, we would need such a plurality in the House and like the Senate. We would also need to have the president be not a liberal and not a conservative. They would need to be like an outside, farther left candidate, and we would have to have them in office for probably the full 8 years to get anything done. It would take a long time to get the kind of policies in place that we would need to substantively change the standard of living for the common worker with UBI and or an increase in the minimum wage. Otherwise, it's just going to blink right back to the top. They're just going to raise the prices of fuel and groceries and rent and cars and everything. They're just going to raise the rates on it. So all it'll cause is inflation, which don't help nobody.
Who thinks that a $15 minimum wage is the crazy socialist agenda is living in a dystopian capitalist nightmare. And we should not prop that up. We should not continue that. People are sleeping in their cars. They can't afford baby formula. There are basic goods that people can't afford to live on $7.25. When you take the minimum wage from several decades ago and you actually account for inflation and productivity gains to today, it should be $24 an hour. So we need other Democrats to understand how deep of a compromise $15 an hour is.
Ooh, there's a lot to unpack there, but before we get into it, I want to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Virtual Shield. A Vice reporter who used the TikTok app but never actually created an account sent a GDPR request to the app. He wanted to find out what data they had on him. To his surprise, TikTok had stored his IP address, what search terms he used, what videos he watched, and when he watched them, and essentially his entire device's digital fingerprint was logged. And to make matters worse, that data was also shared with third parties like Facebook. Staying anonymous online so corporations can't track you is more important than ever, and the first step to doing that is using a VPN. And that is why I recommend Virtual Shield. Virtual Shield is what I trust for myself and my family and friends. I use it every single time I go online. So go to virtualshield.com/LaurenChen or visit the link below to get Virtual Shield today for 50% off plus free for 30 days. The first thing I want to address is the idea that in real dollars, minimum wage was higher in the past than it is now, which is true. Progressives like AOC look at that fact and think to themselves, well, if minimum wage was higher in the past and heck, everybody could afford homes back then and things were totally fine, why shouldn't we raise the minimum wage now so that it's equivalent? Well, allow me to explain why.
Only pay for what you need with Liberty Mutual. I just said that.
It's here. The moment that will define you. You were built for it. And so were we. WGU, ambition never rests.
Why that's a bad idea. In the economy, labor is a commodity, just like any other commodity like wood or oil. And if we look at the law of supply and demand, which, yes, is a law for commodities, we see that when the supply...
Yes, it is a law, but only by the law of science, which is to say, can be flawed and can have additional addendums.
If something is greater, the demand for it, or the price that people are willing to pay for it, decreases. Minimum wage laws are price floors that dictate the minimum amount that people are able to pay for hourly labor. And as you can see from this graph, when minimum wages are higher than what people would usually pay for labor, it creates an excess supply of labor, or in other words, unemployment. And the higher and further away from the proper market value of labor that the minimum wage is, the more unemployment it causes. And this isn't just economic theory, by the way, we see these consequences in the real world as well. Yeah, unlike socialism, economics works in both theory and practice. And just as a side note, if your theory doesn't work in practice, it's probably not a very good theory. Even the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, acknowledges that although raising the minimum wage would lift some people out of poverty, way more people would be left unemployed. As CNBC reports, raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, as President Joe Biden has proposed, would cost 1.4 million jobs over the next 4 years while lifting 900,000 people out of poverty, according to a Congressional Budget Office report Monday. If the federal minimum wage were increased to $15 an hour, sure, that might be nice for the people who actually get to keep their jobs, but what about all the other people who had to be laid off in order to pay for those increased salaries? And this article also notes that, quote, along with the reduction in employment, the federal budget deficit would increase by $54 billion over the next 10 years. Not only would raising the minimum wage increase unemployment, it would also increase the deficit since more people would be relying on government spending in order to get by. CNBC also notes that the report expects that of the 1.4.
But here's the thing, though, right? This is assuming, like, you can say, oh, well, like, lose those jobs, right? But those jobs will come back eventually. See, they're going to cut the jobs now. But all of those positions still need to be filled. They're going to automate some things. But like the reality is that any of the jobs that get lost whenever they raise it to $15 an hour are going to be lost to automation anyway in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's kind of like ripping off the Band-Aid, right? Now we can say, well, we've got all kinds of plans to deal with that automation and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is that automation under capitalism and the way that we have it set up equals loss of jobs. And equals more poverty, right? So all of those jobs that can't be handled for like 15 an hour, those are just jobs that were, you know, that was going to be a self-checkout. And you see it more and more all of the time. So it isn't as if this isn't happening, you know. Any of the jobs that they can't afford to lose, they will not lose because that's how you make money. So, you know, if they want to have a Walmart, they got to have people stock the shelves, right? Well, they can't just get rid of that job. They got to stock the shelves. Shelves got to be stocked, right? That's it. You know, Starbucks, they got to make your coffee. All these places that are paying less than 15 an hour, they will begin to pay you 15 an hour. Mostly at this point, the only reason why most jobs aren't 15 an hour or more is just because there's no ways for workers to advocate for the rights. We can't, you know, in like the state that I live in, you basically aren't even allowed to have a union. I mean, you technically can, but like it's super duper hard to get it done. So I mean, we don't, right? Well, that's why we don't, you know, like that's why we can't advocate for our rights. You know, it ain't about, I don't know. It like these sort of analyses are a little bit off.
Million workers displaced by the higher wages, half would fall out of the labor force completely by 2025, and that young, less educated people would account for a disproportionate share of those reductions in employment. People like AOC may claim to want to help those with fewer skills and less education by raising the minimum wage, but the thing is, they're exactly the people who get laid off in order to pay for these higher wages. When a new minimum wage hike is set, it's not like they're going to be letting go of CEOs or professionals in order to compensate for those higher salaries. But Lauren, I thought we were talking about how the minimum wage was higher in the past. Yeah, no, you're right, hypothetical viewer. Back to the graphs. As we explained before, the higher the minimum wage is than what the market determines the cost of labor should be, the more excess labor there will be, which is unemployment. So how is it possible that in the past the price floor for labor, or minimum wage, was higher, yet unemployment wasn't super crazy? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It's because the supply of labor was smaller. The US, because of things like immigration and just general population growth, has a much bigger supply of labor now than it did in the 50s. And so because the supply supply of labor was smaller, it meant that in the past, when people wanted to hire laborers, they had to pay them more. And so just because the minimum wage was higher back then, it doesn't necessarily mean that unemployment was higher, because it's not really the price floor that determines unemployment, but rather the difference between price floors and market prices. I sincerely hope that all made sense. And something else, aside from the supply of labor, that changes the way that minimum wage laws affect the economy is automation. In the past, if the government told you that you need to pay the people working in your store at least $20 an hour, there wasn't much you could do about it. There was just no way to replace those people. You needed their labor. But that's not the case today. Now, if the government comes and tells me that I need to double the salary of my lowest paid employees, well then it looks like I'm getting some self-service checkout counters and kiosks. Next, let's talk about McDonald's, which
Although it's one of those things where it's like, that is true, and I just discussed it, right? But the reality is that that's not, like, the fact that that is the reality does not mean that we ought not to do nothing. Like, I feel like just because that's the reality of what the fat cats will do does not mean that the answer is to just do nothing, right? Because, like, someone could say, all right, well, you like unions, huh? All right, well, I mean, you know, of course, that all of the fat cats will just go in and speak to all of the guys you have in charge of the unions and offer them money or threaten their lives, and then they'll derail your union from the inside, because no one's going to stand up with the union whenever people are saying that they'll kill your family, right? And it's like, well, then what will we do? Nothing? Is that it? There are strong, devious, and terrible opponents, so we do nothing? That's the solution? You know, I don't think that anyone is under the like delusion that this is going to be easy to get any of this kind of stuff off the ground. But the answer, regardless of how stacked the deck may seem, the answer is never, oh yeah, just give up on it. Just live in a society that does not value your labor and undermines your ability to exist. That just don't seem right. I cannot abide it, and I will not support it, regardless of how logical the argument may be to simply acquiesce, to give in. I will not. I will not place the boot on my own throat, and I will not apologize for it, and I will not advocate for others to do it in my stead. I cannot abide it.
has somehow gotten wrapped up in this whole debate. The other day, AOC tweeted that it is utterly embarrassing that to pay people enough to live is a stance that's even up for debate. Something interesting I've noticed about progressives is that they seem to think people should be paid on what they need versus what they produce. But if I'm an employer and I have a new job posting available, I don't calculate that role's salary by sitting down and saying, all right, so this person is going to need this much to spend on rent and this much to spend on transportation and this much to spend on food, and then add it all up. No, of course not. I look at things like how much value and productivity that person will bring to the company, and obviously more value and more productivity means a higher salary. And I also look at how much competition there will be for the role. The bigger the pool of applicants, the more I can lower the salary and be assured that someone out there is still going to take it. And I know to that progressives will say, but that's so heartless and unfair. But it's like, as cold and calculated as capitalism may seem, the truth is it is the most efficient way to lift people out of poverty. So should we do what sounds good or what actually works? I mean, it's a pretty clear choice in my opinion.
The things that lift people out of poverty tend to be people who happen to work in good ways in a system that is crushing. Right? It's not capitalism that lifts people out of poverty. Right? What lifts people out of poverty, in this case, whenever people say, oh, well, it's capitalism that lifted this third world nation out of like the poverty. It's like, no, it wasn't capitalism that did. It was proximity to something valuable. All the third world countries that have been lifted out of poverty have a natural resource to exploit, or a workforce to exploit, or something else to exploit, something that everyone else wants. Right? That's not capitalism working. Any form of government, any type of economic system can work in a boom town. The trick to finding a good economic system is one that works in a place that ain't doing so hot. That's the challenge. And capitalism tends to do about as well as anything else would in a crappy place, which is to say, pretty damn shitty. The only thing that saves people in a shitty place are people being kind to one another. Community activism. That's what works. Sharing and sharing alike. Now, I mean, Lord knows I got some criticisms of people that blindly throw their lot in with communism. I think that they are. I think that a lot of people want to believe that all of the bad parts of humanity are actually just the bad parts of capitalism. And I'm here to tell you, people can be pretty savage and will be savage under capitalism. And it's been shown under all of the capitalist, or under all of the regimes that are communist. And I mean, I guess we can sit around and like debate, well, that was actually not a communism, that was a totalitarianism, yada 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 yada. But all of that stuff that happened that was bad under various communist regimes, and all that happened under a communism, right? And it happened because people do bad stuff, right? Like people say, oh well, most crime is motivated by economic situations, and a lot of it is. But one of the biggest sections of crime that I despise the most is, say, sexual assault. And there ain't an economic motive behind sexual assault, or at least not much of one. And yet it is prevalent, it is pernicious, and it is terrible. And it exists. And it would exist under communism. It would exist under any system that we currently have, because people are kind of awful sometimes. And so I think people that throw their lot in with communism and say, oh, that fixes it, are deluding themselves. Want to believe more of humanity than there is.
But that must not be the case for everybody, because we're still having this conversation. Back to AOC's tweet, though, she also said, override the parliamentarian and raise the wage. McDonald's workers in Denmark are paid $22 per hour and get 6 weeks paid vacation. $15 per hour is a deep compromise, a big one considering the phase-in. Once AOC put out that post, interest in Denmark's economy, specifically Denmark's McDonald's labor economy, exploded. It was literally trending on Twitter. And a post that I saw, which was surprisingly popular, read that raising the wages means your food will cost a lot more. No, it doesn't mean that at all. Big Mac in USA, $4.80. Big Mac in Denmark, $5.15. McDonald's worker salary in USA, $7.25. McDonald's worker salary in Denmark, $22. There are many things wrong with that tweet. Basically, what this person is trying to argue is that raising the cost of labor doesn't have a huge impact on prices, which is not true. First off, the average price in the US is $4.80. But based on my extensive Googling, it seems like the price of a Big Mac varies a ton depending on location. A Big Mac might be $3.99 in some places, or as high as $6.19 in New York. Some places in America, like New York...
Well, yeah, but in none of those places was it, would it have reflected, like, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's higher depending, but that doesn't disprove that it's going to be a fairly reasonable cost either way. I mean, I'm not saying that it would be, but this doesn't disprove it.
Already already have higher minimum wages and higher costs of living. But what about those places where the cost of living is lower and things are cheaper? Comparing a Big Mac that costs $3.99 to one that costs $5.15 is like a 29% increase in price, which is a big deal. And guess what? Big Macs in Denmark are expensive. They're actually the 5th most expensive in the world. So yes, the high cost of labor absolutely has affected the costs of things in Denmark. In fact, looking at specifics, basic utilities in Denmark are 49% more than they are in the US. Eggs are 87% more expensive, bread is 31% more expensive, transportation is twice as expensive, but as it so happens, white rice is actually more expensive in the US than Denmark. 15% more, to be exact. And to anyone who might be thinking, well, yeah, prices may be higher, but people are paid more, so it all evens out. That's not how that works. Danish people, on average, are under more financial strain than Americans. You know how progressives in America are always complaining about medical debts and student loans, which, don't get me wrong, are an issue, but even taking those things into account, household debt in Denmark is still way higher than it is in the US. It is a fact that Denmark is simply more expensive than the US. And to top it all off, as this Forbes article also notes, quote, if we want to compare wages, we need to compare what they will actually buy. That is, we must adjust for purchasing power parity, or PPP. My goodness, this video is going to be all over the place. But according to Investopedia, purchasing power parity, or PPP, is a popular metric used by macroeconomic analysis that compares different countries' currencies through a basket of goods approach. So when we make comparisons between different countries and talk about PPP, not only are we taking into account currency exchange rates, but we're also taking into account the cost of living. And as the article explains, between Denmark and the US, since cost of living is higher in Denmark, there needs to be a PPP correction of 1.4. That is, in terms of what you can actually buy with any amount of money in the Danish economy, we must divide the market exchange rate by 1.4, which incidentally actually gives $11.70 per hour as the Danish minimum wage. Not only is the cost of living in Denmark way more expensive than people are making it out to be, the minimum wage there is actually also lower than people are making it out to be. And when it comes to Denmark's workforce, don't forget that they have stricter immigration and a smaller population than America, which means that even without a minimum wage or these unions, it's likely that the market price for labor per hour in Denmark would still be higher than it is in America anyway. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say with this video is that the arguments for raising the minimum wage are garbage. If you want to learn more about what we've talked about today, I highly recommend the book Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, and actually just anything from Thomas Sowell. He's all around amazing. But that's pretty much all I have to say for now, and if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me out so much. Until next time.
I kind of feel like she really didn't close the end of that discussing the Sweden stuff very well. I feel like she didn't really, like, I feel like that should have hit home, and it really didn't. Because if you don't really close that hole up, it doesn't really do a lot. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, I'm not so much a minimum wage person as I am a union person. I feel like if you can negotiate for the wages, that's far better than making the state change it. Mainly because if the state changes it, you always got to kind of wonder why the state's changing it. I mean, at this juncture, I don't have any faith for the state changing the minimum wage to help the worker. Some people might say that's needlessly pessimistic, but I mean, come on. You know, I cannot believe that old Joe is actually the savior of the common man. I just, you know, people might want me to believe it, but I cannot. That sounds like nonsense to me. Just nonsense. All right, let's find another video, I guess. What we got? I don't know. You know, honestly, I want to, what do I want to do? I want to go back just a second and
workforce.
re-listen to
Don't
this.
forget that they have stricter immigration and a smaller population than America, which means that even without a minimum wage or these unions, it's likely that the market price for labor per hour in Denmark would still be higher than it is in America anyway. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to say with this video is that the arguments for raising the minimum wage are garbage. If you want to learn more about
Okay. So here's like the thing, right? The arguments for raising the minimum wage may in fact not, or okay, how do I put it? Raising the minimum wage may in fact not lift the average worker out of poverty. They may in fact not be effective at what they aim to do, which is to alleviate the negative plight of the common person. However, the arguments for a minimum wage are very reasonable, right? In that we ought to be advocating for the idea that there should be a reasonable floor that people ought to be able to be paid for an hour's work, which is to say, I would say, the absolute floor that someone ought to be able to be paid ought to be for whatever area you're in. Every worker, every person ought to be able to work full time and earn enough to eat well, not be hungry when they go to bed, have a place to lie down when they want to go to bed, be able to lock their door, be able to heat and cool their house, watch a little bit of television before they go to sleep. I think to deny people that, to expect people to live their lives with less than that, is inhuman. It's unchristian, and it's just pure devilry. I don't believe it. I can't condone it, right? And so whenever people say, "Oh, all of the arguments for like a minimum wage are stupid," like she said, it's like, no, arguing for a minimum wage that ought to be paid is virtuous. Just because the robber barons have outthunk us, right, don't mean it's not virtuous to want a thing. Just because the robber barons have fixed it so that when the common man gets more money, they get more money instead. I mean, that don't mean that we ought not to say, oh, there's an amount of money that you ought to be paid. Because really, when we're talking about an amount of money that we ought to be paid, we're not talking about an amount of money. We're talking about a standard of living. We're talking about what we think people ought to have, what we think people are deserving of, what dignities we think people ought to just have de facto, right? And if you work, I believe you ought to have a place to lay your head and food to fill your belly. And anything less than that is not okay. Paying people $7.25 an hour is scandalous. It is evil, because that means that they don't have enough to feed and clothe themselves. And that's it, as far as I'm concerned. So while we can make arguments here, there, all day long about whether or not actually enacting a $15 wage would effectively raise workers out of poverty as a whole, while we can argue about that all day long and about the socioeconomic impacts on the deficit and on inflation and on this, that, and the other, we can discuss that. I think ultimately it's useless, because the people who want to use those arguments to say that we shouldn't raise the $15 wage aren't arguing it generally, because they think that we ought to, say, concentrate on unions like I do. Like I might say, well, perhaps advocating for a $15 wage isn't as important as advocacy for unions. Getting all those laws repealed to make it so that you can't have a union and then sort of make people within the union like be able to strike, you know, and all that kind of stuff. We have a lot of laws like that in this country. I think it's like 26, 28 states that have laws that say you can't have a strike enforcement, yada yada, right? We have all those kind of things. So it basically makes it so that unions are useless, right? So I would say, all right, well, we need to concentrate on that more, because a $15 wage might not necessarily help us, right? That's not what she's advocating for. She's advocating for, not only does she not want a $15 wage, she don't want shit for the common man. She don't want unions. She don't want UBI, a minimum wage. She wants people to go along like they have been, making $7.25 an hour and having a quadruple up in tiny houses and apartments with 4 other people, right? Sharing a sink and a bathroom. That's what she wants, right? She wants people to shut the hell up so that she can get back to her YouTubing career, making a whole bunch of money, grifting with the far right.